students are gone, but you are still here. And we know how you feel because you are done. But you have so much work to do to get ready for tomorrow. Good afternoon, podcast listeners everywhere. Welcome to After the Bell, a Stunt Brothers production. A podcast that gets inside the life of a teacher and provides a wellness guide for being prepared to take on this most challenging of professions. I'm Martin Stuvel.
And I'm Roy Hunt. And we share your pain, having taught a combined 70 years. The guarantee of this podcast is to make you laugh, make you think, and give you at least one little nugget that you can use in the classroom. So get out your marking, organize your supplies, or just pour yourself a coffee.
I want something stronger.
And listen, engage, and interact with After the Bell, a podcast for you, the hard-working, dedicated teacher who wants free lesson plans, free advice, and a free meal.
Okay, Roy, but I'm not paying for anything more than McDonald's. Well, Mr. Hunt, episode 20. 20.
I can't believe it.
How do you like them apples?
Are we going to say that forever?
I think so.
I think we're going to say, how do you like those bananas?
Yeah,
Doesn't work. No.
It's like when I start talking about my crows and talk about Ringo and Zach and, but a sad note, speaking of famous rock stars, Brian Wilson passed away today as we record this episode. Yes. So that, that's an icon of the world.
It wasn't one of the hits, one of the Beach Boys' famous albums, Animal Sounds?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. No.
So there you go. We're talking about crows, and now we got to animals and Brian Wilson.
And who knows where we're going to go next?
I don't know either.
Well, I always go to my garden, right? That's where I go. And I just, even more this time of year, hours and hours. And it's, as you know, it's my mental health, quiet, calm place.
Yes, it is.
I can lose myself. And even though it's a lot of work, it doesn't feel like work. Right, and I think we all need that kind of outdoor.
When you have work like that, when you have something that you do that doesn't feel like work, then that's unbelievable.
Yeah, and I think you pointed out the physical workout I get, working all the mind and the body and upper body and all these different parts. It's to me the full body workout.
That's
mental health workout, and it's the place to be. And it's about getting outside for me, right?
Yes.
Always that connection with the birds and the hummingbirds and nature, the sound of the stream and all those things. I look up sometimes, I see eagles fly overhead, right?
Well, and this time of year is amazing. I love it because when the weather's so nice, we get our deck covered with our furniture and tables and things that to sit and relax on. Yeah. And suddenly our deck becomes, the square footage of our house increases.
It does feel that way, right?
And it's just a magical place to be after school. That's because I am TOC.
You are still teaching. Yeah.
I'm still teaching. Or just coming home at night and sitting in a chair and having a cup of tea. And I love, we have hummingbird feeders up, and I love hearing the birds. And at nighttime, there are some animals that are lurking around, mostly raccoons.
Yeah.
But to sit in a chair on the deck and have a hot drink and then just listen to the hummingbirds coming in and just watching them. That's amazing.
And there's so much research that shows the importance of that to the human spirit, right? And many cultures celebrate that. I think like in Japan they call it forest bathing, right? And it's what the forest gives off to the soul and to your mental health, and we're losing that. And I think we need to find ways to get outside. Right?
And there's not enough of the students in our schools that are spending time outside. I know a few times as a classroom teacher, I would take my class outside and I would say, let's sit in the grass. And they would look at me like, why? There are things in the grass that will crawl on me. Right. I don't want.
Afraid of some wild
things. Just afraid of some wild things like that. And that kind of reminds me of the book, The Wild Things.
Oh, I love that book.
Yes.
Oh, I read that to my own children, but I remember as a child myself reading that book. And the image that pops in your mind as soon as you mention it was he's in his bedroom.
Max,
right?
Yes. Max is in his bedroom. Max is in his bedroom.
Max is his name. But the bedroom becomes the outdoors. And it's funny because you talked about extending your house outdoors, but really that's his instant moment when he wakes up and suddenly the walls are no longer there. And he's outside, even though he's inside the building.
And he's outside where the wild things are.
Where the wild things are. I think that could be our theme for today.
I think
right?
it would be a great theme to
because
have.
why that book does such a beautiful job, we're often afraid of where the wild things are. And I think that's the theme and the point of that book is to say, you don't need to be afraid of where the wild things are. We need to embrace it, and it's better for all of us, right? And we know with kids today, they're not naturally going outside anymore. They are on their computer. They're inside. They're not getting that time outside that you and I had as children, where we were gone from dawn to dusk and just home in time for dinner.
For dinner.
If we knew what was good for us.
Yes. So then our theme would be outside.
Yes.
Where the wild things are.
Yeah. So I think we should, first of all, right now we're recording in the box.
Yes.
Right, inside. But to do this justice, we should get outside. We should go on a field trip.
Oh, I would love to go on a field trip.
And why don't we go into my back garden?
Oh, I love that.
Maybe we can hear the stream in the background as we talk to a guest. But why don't we find a guest to talk to who we think is a real expert in this?
Yes. I think I know someone.
Okay, who could that be?
I remember going to outdoor school.
Outdoor school is a big part of North Vancouver,
I
yes.
met the principal there. His name is Victor Elderton.
Yeah, I think he was there for over almost 30 years
30
as a
years.
teacher and principal. He was an icon who really brought that into his heart, that place, and really made it what it is, right?
Yes. And then now he is, I believe he's a faculty advisor, is he?
Yeah, and he teaches as well at both Simon Fraser
and
UBC,
UBC. Yeah.
and works with student teachers in outdoor education, and has just a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of reading, a wealth of understanding about this topic and the importance of this topic.
So I think we should invite him to your garden.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
So welcome. Today we have Victor Elderton, and we really appreciate you coming on after the bell with Roy and Martin.
Yeah.
Before we get into anything, we always start with a little icebreaker.
Sure.
Just to set the tone.
Sure.
So just say the first thing that comes into your mind. It's called ABC 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
So Roy's going to start with ABC.
So A, hiking or biking?
Walking.
Nice.
B, farm study or forest study?
Forest.
Forest. And the last one, David Suzuki or Bill Nye?
Oh. Can we create a hybrid here?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Yeah. If there's aspects, both of those are people I would take as personal kind of mentors in a lot of way. The excitement that Bill Nye brought about,
Yes.
I use that in lots of different kind of teaching techniques and things like that.
Yeah.
And the fact that David Suzuki, I have had more than one direct interaction with him. And one of the best things he said to me, they needed a spot to take pictures of eagles. And of course, Brackendale, there on the Cheakamus River, where I spent a lifetime, was a really good place to do that. And so he was coming down. It was when he was hosting the Nature of Things. And so I had David Suzuki, and I could ask him, kind of thing. And so I asked him, what would you say? Because at that time, Shell Oil was offering money, if you wanted to do environmental projects. And I said, there's a little bit of a, isn't that a conflict of interest? And he said, I guess you could say that. But he said, I would take the money because what you're going to do with the money is so much stronger than what they could potentially do. And the other interaction that I had with him was that it was at a book signing. And I was there with another, person from the outdoor school, and we went to listen, and there was a book signing, and we went up, and we wanted to chat. And he didn't really have much time of the day to talk to adults. But right after this, there was a little child, and they brought forward this little crocheted, washcloth or something. And he just opened up. And he just was so gracious to this child and so welcoming to this child. And I went, okay,
wow.
He's telling me kind of where the priorities are. Somebody who's already invested in everything else that's not really that
No,
important.
no.
But this child,
genuine moment.
a genuine moment, and it was really,
Wow.
So it was pretty cool.
Awesome. So, okay, now 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
Fiction or nonfiction?
Depending on my mood.
Okay.
Sometimes nonfiction is, I like to have nonfiction in short form.
Okay.
Fiction is more sort of my long form kind of read.
Okay.
And I would tell you also that I would prefer, if there's a 1, 2, 3 on this, I would do the audio version. I have sometimes done the audio version while I do the reading version, because I'm quite a slow reader.
Yeah.
But I retain stuff for a long
So
time.
you mean you're listening while you're reading?
Yes.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah. And so I did that with Robin Wall Kimmerer's book,
Okay.
and Braiding Sweetgrass. And it was really interesting to hear her voice as I'm reading her words.
She has a great voice.
Yeah, she does have a
Yes.
great voice. And she's, just an amazing person. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Okay, number 2, UBC or SFU?
That's an interesting one, because I work at both places.
Okay, there you go.
And when I tell the SFU people that I do, faculty advising at UBC, they go, "Oh, that place." And when I tell people that I'm at SFU from UBC, they go, "Oh, that place." So they're different flavors, and so. There are some aspects. I get to do some really special work, mentoring work at SFU that I don't think would be possible in some ways at UBC, and especially experiential learning work at SFU that isn't so prevalent at UBC. However, at UBC, I work with a very small group of people who are going to be new teachers, and I love that mentoring work. So I would tell you the change in the work that I do now is before maybe I was more of a frontline person.
Yeah.
Now I'm sort of working with people who are going to be frontline people, and how can I facilitate their learning. So the thing that's a common thread between what I did and now after the bell, kind of thing, is centered a lot on mentorship. If you wanted to find a stream through all of that stuff, it's about mentorship. There's an aspect of mentorship that I really like, and I think it's because I also had amazing mentors.
It must be nice for you to then, if you have experiences that are different at SFU and UBC, to kind of cover the whole gambit. Right?
Yeah, it is. It is, and there are different flavors. I have been welcomed, I want to say, at both places.
Yeah.
But the nice thing about being after the bell, I don't have to be in the deep trenches, right?
Yeah.
So I can just sort of. I remember one time Anthony Hopkins said that where he was in his career as an actor was that he's at a point that he can pick and choose the things that he wants to do the most, and that's what I find both at UBC and SFU. I can choose the pieces that I want to do the most, because I had a great career and a nice pension and everything else to support me, but I can choose what I want to do.
That's what I'm enjoying most about retirement, is choosing.
Yeah.
And I'm busier than ever.
Yeah.
But I'm in control of that.
Yes.
And I loved my teaching career, loved the kids, loved teaching, but the noise gets to you, right? All that background noise that wears you down.
And the things that you have to do.
Yes.
And whenever I confront the things that you have to do, that's when I kind of went, I'm going to walk away from that, to a certain things. And I find that a little bit in my PhD work, right? There's things that I have to do.
Yeah.
So I've been playing at my PhD for quite a long time, partially because of personal things that have happened in my life, mostly centered around, unfortunately, my mom and her end-of-life, dementia, end-of-life stuff, and COVID. That all that just sort of knocked it out of the ballpark. But also, I like the playing part. I find myself like, I have two metaphors or two analogies that I work with. One is that I feel that what I'm doing right now, it's like if you go swimming in salt water, you know that when you come out of the salt water, and if you just let the sun dry your skin, there's these little crystals that form on your skin. So one way that I've envisioned this is like what I'm doing right now is I am swimming through learning. And when I come out of these experiences, it's my job to discover what these little crystals are.
Fantastic.
So that's one way that I have of looking at it. Another way that I have of looking at it is that in the work that I'm doing, it's like I'm letting the learning kind of, once again, it's a water metaphor, kind of wash over who I am. And then I sort of say, okay, so the water washed over me, so where is that stream taking me now?
Yeah.
And I have those affordances.
Number 3, and you mentioned mentorship in your life. If you go back to your early years, maybe a student in elementary or high school, is there a teacher that stands out for you in your memory? And you could share that?
Yeah. Just the other day, I have a teacher who is UBC program. They have this 3-week education experience that's outside of their practicum. They call it their community field experience, the CFE. Anyway, so I have someone that's going to be at one of our elementary schools. I walked in to talk to the person that was sponsoring the student. It's my grade 5 classroom. and I want to say my life at Upper Lynn changed. Grade 1 and 2 were good. Miss Kelly and Mrs. Bailey were my 2 teachers, grade 1, grade 2. But it's in grade 3 where the world really opened up. I had this amazing teacher in grade 3. Her name was Beverly Oram. And Beverly's had spent a life with her husband. He was a civil engineer. And she told us stories of the Amazon. She told us stories of these amazing places that she had been to and told us what she did there. And she lived on the road, just past end of the line.
Yeah.
Sort of, there's a road that goes up there. She lived there.
Wow.
And one day she said, "There's a monkey in my backyard." And she really meant it. Somebody, this monkey. I got on my bike, because at that time you rode your bike anywhere.
Exactly.
And I was in her backyard. I never saw the monkey, but there was the potential of seeing the monkey, And so she was very important. And then I went from that was, then I had this other teacher, Miss Keeley. She was actually from the U.S. And we, at that time at Upper Lynn, must have been expanding because our classroom was in the gym. Oh. She was an amazing teacher. And then I went from there to Marilyn Vasily, who I ended up doing the early pilot project with for the Squamish program, the Big House program at Cheakamus Center. And she was my grade 5 teacher. And then I had this grade 6 teacher. He was an exchange teacher from New Zealand who brought in sort of inquiry science. So I want to say 3, 4, 5, 6, those years. And then when my parents we moved to Maple Ridge, I ended up in a class of grade 6s and 7s. There was a very small group of grade 7s in this grade 6 class. We were all new. And I had an amazing teacher there as well. His name was Ken Smith. And Ken, I don't think this would be allowed today. And so he was particularly interested in, experiential history. So there were 3 boys in this grade 7 group and 3 girls in this grade 7 group. And he basically said, go find out in, Maple Ridge, Haney, Pitt Meadows, who would be people that might have stories about this place. And literally, we would get on, and this is going to really age me, we would get on our Mustang bikes, these lemon green bikes with the big banana seats. Yeah, absolutely. And, the high handlebars.
I'm right there with you.
That's right. Yes. And we would get on those things, and we would take off.
Yeah.
We would just sort of say, we're going to Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so's house.
Yeah.
And we collected oral history from those folks. And then he allowed us to use the stage in the small gymnasium, and we put together this whole history report based on interviews. And one of the people that was in my class, his family was like second generation living in Haney or Maple Ridge. So he had some really good family contacts. And it was like, in research now, there's this term called snowballing. You get this idea, and then the ball rolls, and then they give you somebody else. So they would say, oh, well, we have a story about this, but you need to have a story about that. Yeah.
I always find with education that, they always come up with new terms, inquiry learning, experiential learning. But you look back at great teachers, they were doing that a long time ago, right? They were.
Yeah.
Before the term came up.
Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Yeah. And I think typically what happens is all good teachers are. And I think Suzuki once said this, actually. The best work comes from doing and then looking at the theory of why that happens. So his big thing was one of the reasons why we are in we are in an environmental crisis, existential crisis, is because most of human life was experience leading theory. With the development of the atomic bomb, that was theory began leading what we do. And, I hear the same thing, from the person from Eastern Canada who said is the godfather of AI, for example. He now laments that he played a role in that.
Yeah.
He played a role in that. And it was very interesting because in a trip that I once did, I went to Los Alamos. It was part of New Mexico, and we went to Los Alamos. And in the visitor center in Los Alamos, they have reproductions of the letters between Einstein, Oppenheimer, and Truman.
Wow.
And you can see within the writing is some very cautionary things. Should we actually be doing this? Where's the moral aspects of doing this? Should we be thinking about doing these
Oppenheimer
things?
dealt with that his whole life, didn't
Yes, he did. He did. And the movie, that on his life kind of got into that, right? And so the question then becomes, should you do that? There's a term in ecological thinking called conservatism. And when I say that term now, people think of it in political terms, and it can be seen as a very sort of non-progressive way of thinking about things. But in ecological terms, it really means to be cautious. There's an aspect of being conservative, to go slow, not simply do things because they can be done. And I think what I draw from some of Suzuki's writings and thinking is exactly that. We have to think about this a little bit more. And this is where, in more recent time, in a more serious way, what I say explicit way, I've been looking a lot more in terms of indigenous thinking. Not only indigenous thinking of the Pacific Coast, which is where I've grown up, but indigenous thinking from around the world. So even indigenous thinking from what my heritage which would be Northern European. What's the indigenous thinking that was going on in those times, and what do they have to say about people who basically lived in place? When you have to live in a place and you don't have the luxury or privilege or however you want to describe it of just simply going wherever you want to go and think you can just go wherever you want to go, there's an aspect of permanence. There's an aspect of understanding what place is.
And don't you think, with climate change now more than ever, that's what we need, that way of thinking?
Oh, gosh, yeah. Yeah.
And do you see conservatism taking it slow with climate change? We're facing an existential crisis on that.
Yeah. Well, I guess, but there's a part of me that also knows enough, and I don't. This is my lament. My lament is, if humans don't exist, that's our problem. We created this scenario. I don't want to think about that, but as we go down,
what do we take with us?
That's the issue.
Yeah,
That's what goes to my heart.
Yeah.
That's really what goes to my heart, and my passion is that
if we go the way of the dinosaurs, that's fine. But what we've left behind, that's the worry.
Yeah, that's right. And not only what we leave behind, but what did we take out on our way through? Yeah. When a giant asteroid hits the planet, right? That's not making sort of a conscious decision about, okay, I'm going to hit the planet, and I'm going to hit the planet in a shallow sea, close to what we call Yucatan today, and that's going to create a whole bunch of scenarios, which, by the way, is, if you haven't listened to it, my favorite podcast is A Bad Day for Dinosaurs.
Okay.
It's a fantastic
I'm writing
piece.
that down.
Yes. It's from Radiolab.
Okay.
It's dramatized, and I think they've done it also as a stage kind of presentation as well. But that's a fascinating podcast, and it's called A Bad Day for Dinosaurs, because the thing that always fascinated me as a child growing up, and even today, like, why did certain things survive and not other things survive? Well, our mammalian kind at that time, we were generally kind of tiny. And to stay out of the clutches of things that might like to eat us, we generally lived underground. So unless it's changed a lot, unless the science has changed a lot since the last time I sort of got into this a little bit, all it took was living underground by about 4 or 5 inches. And you were protected.
Amazing.
Anything that was above the 4 or 5 inches, because that was the other thing I could never understand, and what they go through very well with regards to this piece, is there's one thing, it's the explosion, okay? And the explosion is like, sad to think about it. We think about it as so many atomic bombs, kind of thing.
Yes.
But anyhow, there's this pyroclastic flow, there's all this other kind of stuff, but that doesn't go around the world.
No.
But dinosaurs died all around the planet at the time. So what they did in that particular podcast that I hadn't really thought about is it wasn't that. What killed everything everywhere was all the material that went up into the atmosphere, and then what happens is most of it, like something like 80 to 90% of it, rained down as fire, because all this got heated up in the atmosphere, and just the friction of coming down the atmosphere, and that went around the world.
Really?
Wow.
So it was like a firestorm around the world. They said in that podcast that some of the material, believe it or not, had enough escape velocity that it probably made it to Mars.
That's phenomenal.
It just blew me away. Like, it just blew me away. When I think about these things, Robert Bateman once told me, he said, the thing about nature is it's hard to understand, but it's more than we can understand. Yeah. And so, it's this aspect of thinking and having time to think in these terms. And see, that's the plus and minus of the world that we live in right now. I live in this amazing place in what I call the Canadian Southwest, in the Canadian Southwest on the coast, and I have the time, I have the resources that allow me to think. Yeah. And I can sort of play around with these ideas. If I'm in a crisis situation, I can't think of these ideas. No. You just start thinking, like, where's my water going to come from next? Where's my food going to come from next? And so I think that if I have any responsibility, it's the fact that if I am coming from this kind of place, then I have a moral responsibility. Because in this work, we basically, I believe, and some of my good colleagues believe, that it's really about morals and ethics. It's not about the content. It's not about learning about the complexity or anything else. It's about what drives those things. It's about the morals and the ethics that you have. And I've worked on 3 versions of the environmental education, guidelines for environmental learning in the province. The first one, which was in the 90s, another one that came out in the early 2000s, and we're just completing a 3rd version of that. And basically it comes down to, what are your ethics? Okay. What are your ethics? What are your values? And how do you make the decision to choose what those are? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Especially in this day and age. We're seeing all kinds of decisions about morals and ethics.
Morals and ethics, and it all comes down to that. And so, and I also believe if we can't create a scenario where we can extend the morals and ethics to other humans that we hopefully will understand, how can we then extend it to forests like cedar or rivers or whatever? And there's going to be, there's a new book that Robert McFarland, who's a really great author, and it's called something like If a River is Alive. Our river's alive.
Okay. Yes.
Yes. Our river's alive. And he's doing, the Sierra Club has a free online thing next week that I'm looking forward to. I heard one interview that he's done about it, and I've read other works that he's worked on. So, you asked the question before about fiction, nonfiction. That's the kind of, that kind of fiction in some ways is kind of like really fascinating to me. And some of my sort of free reading, quite honestly, had to do with historical fiction. The idea that you take this idea and you take this idea and then what if you played it out in a certain way?
Yeah. It's learning from it, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when we're talking about outdoor educational experiences, being participating actively in the environment, how do we get our students to think about their experience in a way that is reflective and can help in a deeper understanding of this place that we're living in?
Mm-hmm. Those are really good questions. A while back, when Richard Louve's book came out, Last Child in the Woods, Richard Louve was a reporter for a San Diego paper, I believe, and he was writing a lot about fatherhood and families. And in his interviews, something would come out about being outside as a family, being in nature as a family. So he like a good journalist, he dug into that more, and he started to sort of dig into this perspective of we don't play outside the same way we used to, right? We don't do
Yes.
that. We don't do that. I mean, I know that, the classic Mustang bike is a unique thing to my era, but I'm not aware now of, sort of something within the child's culture now that would be similar. Like we all had to, there was something about the image of the Mustang bike, and everything else. But now it's more like, as we just saw, how can we get our hands on the next Nintendo, PlayStation? But to go back to your question about how do we get them. So when we've looked at that work of how to do that, there are kind of 10 basic things, but the 3 most important things are this. 1, daily access. It becomes part of the practice. It doesn't take anybody, look, if you wanted to be really good at playing guitar, Martin, then, you got to practice, and you got to do that. And daily at the beginning is incredibly important, right? If you want to learn how to play soccer, one of the things sometimes I found myself in discussions with is people who really wanted, I worked at a place that was heavily impacted by the 2010 Olympics. And I really didn't have a problem with the 2010 Olympics. My problem was if you're going to spend $200 and some odd million to improve the road up to Whistler, where's the $200 and some odd million special money that comes in as a legacy to education, for example?
Right.
And experiential-based learning.
Yeah.
Because really, ultimately, I think the Olympics is about getting people outside and experiencing things and things like that. But where's the $200 million then to do that as a legacy, right?
Yeah.
That was my issue. My issue was, that's fine, it's about priorities, right? So daily access, easy access. So, in schools, quite often, kindergarten classrooms have an outdoor.
Yeah.
They can just leave and they can go outside.
Yeah.
Why isn't every
Yeah, we were talking about that.
Today. Yeah.
Why doesn't every classroom have an outside door?
Yeah.
You know, for me, when I brought my work more into schools, I'd have to be quiet when I went down the hall. I was lucky enough that my classroom at the last school that I worked in was only one classroom away from being outside. Okay, but then there was all of those kinds of rules that I had to be worried about because I didn't want to disrupt the learning of other other children. And so easy access, daily access, but this is where the teacher comes in. You have to have a mentor. You have to have someone who introduces you to that. I don't think within our species we naturally go out and just do stuff automatically.
No.
We're not, no. I mean, look, Martin, I know enough about the fact that you recently got back from Africa.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, within probably 2 or 3 hours of a gazelle being born, it can run with the herd.
Yeah.
I don't know any child within 2 or 3 hours of birth that can do any running, kind of thing. Yeah. It's just a different way.
Yeah.
It's just a different survival thing, right? And so I think that we're pre-programmed to look at where are the mentors. And the mentors doesn't have to necessarily be our parents, but who is the person that provides that? And you asked that question. You asked that question. Who were the mentors?
Yeah.
I just listed from grade 3 to grade 7, and I could actually give you also a biology teacher in grade 8 that I had, Mr. Bjorn, that were the mentors for me, and that they kind of guided my path, and to a point then that I could leave off from that. And those 3 things working together, if we can put those 3 things working together on a regular basis, then I think the possibilities of that. Now, I would guess, with knowing enough about the two of you, because we spent basically a career together, right? That's probably already built into your family structure. Yeah. But then I think about where I grew up, and definitely I wanted to say that 2 of my early mentors were my parents. My mother was a very sensitive and very artistic person who was more about the aesthetics of place and a very deep empathy. But my father was very playful and experiential and adventurous. And they were actually a really good pair. They're a really good pair. And sadly, my mother's mental health issues over time became greater and greater. And I think they became less cohesive as a unit. But in my early years, my formative years, from basically the time I was born until I was 10 or 12 years old, they were amazing. And there wasn't anything we wouldn't do collectively as a family. So me, there's a form. Different people have different sort of tendencies, different ways of being. I often express myself through biology and through living things. I mean, my first tropical fish tank was given to me by my mom and dad at Christmas, and I've been keeping tropical fish. So if you came to my house today, and as people do, I have a whole room. That's my man cave.
I remember at outdoor school.
Yeah,
right? You had great tanks.
Yeah. Well, I have 25 now.
Yeah.
And and fish kind of flow through my life. So my world was that supported by those 2 things, and my dad's adventurous spirit and experiential way of being kind of balanced my mom's aesthetics and sort of sensitivity. And it was a really good combination. And so in my neighborhood, my parents were the ones that went to, at that time, every PTA meeting or PAC meeting today. They were the ones that volunteered for everything. I remember my dad brought home, at one PAC meeting, my mom was very artistic, as I said. They were doing some clay work. Well, my mom's clay work came back. It was just like this amazing thing. And my dad's thing looked like, I don't know. It didn't look like what he said it was supposed to look like anyways, because he just didn't have that. But he was okay. He was okay with being vulnerable and sort of doing this and kind of go, oh, look at your mom's thing, and mine's supposed to be represent the same thing, and it doesn't look the same, does it? So who's got the talent here? Anyways, but the two of them together provided those opportunities. So they were my first ones, and there's a form of learning that two researchers from, I think they're both from Yale, Kellert and a guy by the name of E.O. Wilson, talk about being biophilic. And I would tell you, I was a biophilic child. One of my early memories is one time I brought my mom this flower that to me looked different. And she said, where did you get that? And I said, well, just over here. And she said, you just found an endangered species. And thankfully, I didn't pull up the whole plant. It was just the flower part. And so and that was so affirming to me. The rest of my life, I've gone out looking for patterns of things.
Yeah.
Where to find patterns.
Yeah.
So those three things are really important. And one of the things that's a really interesting thing. So, there's responses to different crises, right? So the BC Parks Foundation has a very pretty tremendous plan. Their idea is that they want to develop outdoor learning places in every school in the province, every high school, every elementary school. They're going to they're working on now. They have 5 pilot districts that they're starting with, and they're going to be saying this is the case. So that theoretically could cover the 2 points. It could cover easy access and daily access.
Yeah.
My interest now is about how do I help create the mentors that can use these places. You think about the refuge at Ridgeway, for example. If there's a good mentor there, it gets used on a regular basis.
Yeah.
Cleveland has this beautiful courtyard space. If there are good mentors there, it gets used but most of the time they don't get used.
And especially in North End, some of our sites are incredible. And I was fortunate in the last 5 years of my career to work at Mount Royal with 2 creeks running through, and I had easy access. And I would establish things every day that was outdoor education. Every Thursday afternoon was all math outside, right? No matter what the weather. And you just make it the norm, and the kids expect it, and it just becomes healthy that way. But it's that easy access and taking advantage of what we have.
Yes, and 100%.
Yeah.
So I think it's really admirable what the BC Parks Foundation is doing, and they've asked me to participate, to a certain extent. And I'm hoping to help them think about that mentor piece. If you have a Martin Stubble there or Roy Hunt there, that really believes in this stuff. Because the other thing that you can go to almost any school and see a garden project that's now fallen into disrepair.
Yes.
Or you can see something. I did in my last years in the district, I did a survey of every school in the district and tried to suggest on the school grounds, but also near the school grounds, what could be potentially learning sites for them. And obviously at Mount Royal, it was the creeks, or Braemar also has a creek that goes right by it. Seymour Heights has a creek that goes right by it. And what I found as a lasting memory, and you have to remember that that was in 2013, so like 12 years ago now, the kids were actually telling us where they wanted to be. So typically on a school ground, so much space is given over to some kind of artificial field. And most of the time, less than 10% of the students in the school are on that playground, right? In that space, because that's how they express themselves. Everywhere around the space, it's like a rabbit's warren. Trails, this, that, quiet spots, all these other kinds of things. So one of the things I think that the BC Parks Foundation is trying to do is bring some of that into the school grounds And interestingly, because it's being done by the BC Parks Foundation, if they do it right, they are going to add it to the goals that the provincial government has for how many sort of wild spaces we have. So they almost become extensions of provincial parks.
Nice.
You know, and if you think of the best sort of modern urban kinds of places, what are they doing? They're allowing natural things to come into spaces. I think in Japan, I might be saying the word wrong, but there's this concept called the Miyagawa garden. And what it is these are small acreages where native plants and things come in, and they purposely set up this opportunity for those things to come into the city. And the biodiversity in those places, as you might guess, goes right out the roof. You know, if you compared that to a more manicured space or something like that. So the opportunity of bringing those things, because as we become more urban and suburbanized, which I don't think necessarily is a bad thing, it's just like, how do you want to be that? You know, I mean, we have the luxury of living in probably one of the most livable urban suburban spaces. But I would tell you, because for a short time, well, 8 years, I was involved with the Museum of North Vancouver. I was the commission chair while we built the new museum on Esplanade. And when we were doing sort of our exhibit stuff, we started to ask ourselves the question, why is it like this? Like, why is it like this? And it's because of the creeks. The creeks divide us up. And so by dividing us up, now we have these little communities like you have.
It dictates where the roads go.
Absolutely.
So often, right?
Exactly. That's right.
You know?
And so you can't have roads everywhere.
No.
Right? So it makes you this little community, this city within these cities. Yeah. At least communities within communities, neighborhoods within neighborhoods. And so it allows you to be able to do that. And some of the work that I'm doing now, the way that we would describe it is that they're biocultural work. So that term basically means that there's an existing biology or ecology in a particular place, but that existing biology and ecology in a particular place, when people come to that place, influences the type of culture that happens there. But then that culture also influences the biology of that place, or the natural world in that place. And these two things are in a dance. The best of those scenarios is when those dances become like very choreography, like they're like a ballet. That's the best. That's the best, because that's where both things are kind of working in unison. And I would say that one reason why now we quite often will be looking to indigenous ways of being here, but also in other places, is typically indigenous cultures had found some kind of balance like that. But there are indigenous cultures, before any European showed up, that basically didn't do so well. Yeah. You can go to the Yucatan today, and you can go and you can interact with Mayan people, but they're not the classic Mayan people, right? And so they had to step back from that highly classic time that we know existed, because we have the pyramids and we have the writing from those times and all those kinds of things, and all of that happened well before any European conquest happened. And you can go to other parts in the world where the European sort of Western perspectives of things weren't around, but there were rises and falls of different kinds of these classic kinds of societies. So that's the question: can a classic society, and I think that's the great experiment that we're in right now, can sort of like a classic society find a balance? Is that possible? No. I don't know.
But, it's interesting. I grew up on a farm. It was a working farm. We had animals. I was outside all the time, and I saw I didn't see the outside space as the outside space. I saw it as a continuation
Correct.
of my living environment.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result of that, I had a great appreciation for the land that we were on and the animals that we had. How do we get teachers, the mentors, and our students to look at the outdoor space as a continuation of their living environment and not just a place that's outside of my home or a place that's outside of my classroom?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. And I think that the aspect of that question is that how do we make it part of that daily practice? That's what I was trying to say before, is that if you can start to make it part of the daily practice, I think also you want to see it as part of the community practice. So you know, when I left my full-time work in the school district, I've spent some time with a group of people called Wild Pedagogies. And these people are kind of looking at, they have 8 touchstones. And I've done workshops, even this last year, I've done 3 or 4 workshops on what these touchstones are and how we might be able to engage in these touchstones. But what I was leading to with regards to that is in Nordic culture, in Sweden and Norway in particular, they have this term called frosliv. And frosliv means outdoor life. Now, from a North American perspective, that may be that we just go outside and we camp, right? But from a Scandinavian perspective, it's like you are completely embodied in that place. It goes beyond just the camping, just the outdoor cooking, just the outdoor vistas. It also goes into opportunities for the contemplation of stuff. And I think that if there's anything right now that is really concerning from my perspective, is where do we allow for that contemplation, that reflection, that valuing of those kinds of things? Because you can get caught up, you know, in how fast-paced things are, right? And so I don't know if it fits or not, but I know in Norway, one of the core subjects in the senior grades is philosophy, where, you know, and I'm sure that there are students that hate the philosophy class, you know, kind of thing, but it's saying we as a culture believe that philosophy, or understanding where we are in the world and trying to come to some kind of sense of where we are and who we are in the world, is incredibly important. And I like to think that maybe when I'm in, you know, senior grade 10, 11, or 12, I'm kind of going, well, why am I wasting my time on this? And then some experience happens when I'm an adult where the proverbial penny drops and you kind of go, I'm understanding why that is there. You know, I'm understanding now why these kinds of ideas are important and those kinds of things. And you know, maybe we talked about it earlier, but one of the things that I'm really fascinated with is that if you're in a position of privilege, which I truly accept I'm in a position of privilege, then what is my responsibility in that privilege? And then what kinds of things can I do? That's why I've continued on. Like people have said, I think that I know some amazing educators that they finished their time in school and they have every right to do this. I'm not telling them they're not. But they were so amazing as teachers. They had so many other things to be able to offer. And maybe not offer in the same way that I'm doing, you know, working, you know, in the system really and with universities, but in other kinds of contexts, in other kinds of things. Because if you think of indigenous cultures, who's the first person that gets fed? Who's the first person that gets recognized? It isn't the newest person.
No, it's not. No.
It's the person who carries the knowledge, who's had the time to think about these things, that maybe wasn't able to think about those things. And so some people have said
whale populations do that too, right?
That's right. Yeah. And so sometimes people ask me, like, what are you doing a PhD now for? You know, kind of thing. And I sort of said, well, and it was one of my Scandinavian friends that said this, you either do it at the beginning of your career and it sort of defines your career, or you use it like I'm doing, it's like a capstone project. It's allowing me to bring together some kinds of ideas and some kinds of thoughts in the way that I'm doing. And hopefully for some people, they may pick it up. I'll try to do some workshops and, if I'm invited to do speaking about it, whatever. But for me, it hasn't been cathartic. I wouldn't say it's been cathartic. I would say that it's been really insightful. It's my opportunity to sort of sit with what has happened to me. I mean, part of my thesis talks about, and it's all centered on, what did, the area on the Cheakamus River, what did it teach me?
Okay.
Okay. And the research is about that. And when I actually worked it out, because at that time, I lived and worked at the place basically 5 days a week, over 200 days a year. I put in 96,000 hours at that place because it was overnight, and I was there overnight, and that's the way that the position was, and I sort of took it from the perspective, maybe it was from my natural perspectives, is like, what is this place offering me? So yes, I have to be here overnight, which is not necessarily the best thing in the world. But if I am going to be here overnight, what can happen overnight? What kinds of things? And it allowed me time to get to know you two, for example, and we would share a meal together. And it wasn't a situation where, see you at lunch and not see you again.
I think anybody at that time would say it was part of your soul,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Going out to outdoor school and being
Yeah.
with Victor and seeing
Yeah.
what you were doing for the place. Yeah.
And so I've had the opportunity now to kind of think about all of those things. And one of my Scandinavian friends pointed that out to me and said, this is a good time to do it. Because it's a good time to do it because you can kind of think of where you have been and how this place is influenced. And I guess if there's something different about what I'm doing now, I'm also trying to think deeply into who were my other teachers beyond the people that I worked with. And so the way that this research is structured is around, and this is sort of like what's coming out of the work. There was an educative world that was created. You could call it was a biological world that was created that the education existed in. And it existed in this trifecta. It started with river. River is kind of the foundation of that particular world. In this case, the Cheakamus River. The Cheakamus River and salmon are the first sort of players on that stage. You can't have salmon there unless you have a river there. And the river came, right after the glaciation, 14,000 to 20,000 years ago. And then salmon quickly started to inhabit that place. Well, by salmon being in that place, the nutrients that they bring to that place, the physical nutrients they bring to that place, and with the warming of the climate, about 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, cedar starts growing in that place. And those three things interacting with each other create this world that everything else becomes possible in terms of a learning space. So for me, that's the learning world that I'm describing in the thesis. But ultimately, what I'm saying is to those people that read it that are maybe motivated by it, I'm challenging you to find what is your world, what's created the space that's made it possible for you to think, to understand, to come to better understand those things. And how can you do that? And what kinds of things are they? I could, postulate, for example, that if you are somebody from, the Great Plains, that may be open sky and grasslands, and at one time, millions of bison, right, for example. And that was the world that was created in that space. If you came like I think you grew up in Ontario.
Yes.
Right. And so for you, it could be maybe Lake Country, for example, and in Muskoka, or it could be, or even southern part of Ontario. It could be, that sort of Appalachian, hardwood forest, kind of thing. And that's a world that's created. And then within that world, so what I'm asking people to do is, I'm telling you my story, but what I'm asking you to do through the research is to say, I want you to think about your place.
When you talk about education and the child, and it always seems to go back to the classroom, though. And have you read The Anxious Generation?
Yeah.
And also, there's a great Netflix series called Adolescence.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just this online world now, and the effect of that. And it always falls on the school now to correct it. So what do you see as the role that parents play in this to try to get kids outdoors? Because they're often, I know they have busy lives, and they're not like when we were all children, that we were on our Mustang bikes getting out there. And it's actually safer out there.
Hey, I got a 10-speed once.
Yeah, I finally did too.
But I put a banana seat on it because it was more comfortable.
It didn't feel right without it, right?
Right.
And it was actually safer then outside.
That's right.
People have this fear of the world out there, but it's, far more dangerous when they stay in their room and go online.
Yeah.
So how do we counter that, and how do we bring parents into this equation, this discussion? Because those parents that are doing it, and they're partners in this, but some are resistant, and they're busy, so the easy thing to do is just let their kid be on the iPad and not get them outside.
Yeah. I think that's a great question, because I mentioned before in one of my answers to some of the comments was it's about a community. Mm-hmm. So in the same way, Roy, you were saying, there's no differentiation between, and when I say classroom, I don't see any walls, right? So I want to be clear in that. The classroom is just sort of a learning space to me. Now I'm teaching at the university. I don't think I teach inside ever, right? We're doing this thing called the Akatsum Field School. Akatsum is the Squamish name for house sound. And anyways, and so we don't teach inside for 2 months. And so I don't spend much time with regards to that. And I think that I would say the same thing is that the differentiation between community and school, I think some of that needs to dissolve as well. Because I think school is community and community is school. Yes. Right?
We've lost that.
And I think it needs to be that. And now maybe that comes from the fact that I did at that time at UBC, when I did my teacher training, I came out of a cohort called community education, which was all about the school is community, community is school. And so how do we make that possible? So I think, in more practical terms.
There were community schools in North Van
Absolutely.
at that time, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. There were. And there were 4 or 5 of them. And I think there's only one now, because I think it's directly affiliated with Squamish Nation at Norgate, for example. So the idea is how, what's the permeable aspect of that, right? What's the permeable aspect? And so maybe in a practical way, Roy, one of the things that I did to try and break that down when I was working at Norgate is I was teaching something on, in quotes, extreme environments, was a topic for grade 6s and 7s in science. I think at the time it was a topic. Anyways, I had a problem with that, because whose extreme environment is that? For some organisms, that's not extreme. That's their life. Living in a Mediterranean type climate, that's extreme. That's extreme. That's extreme. But anyways, I didn't get into that too much, because I didn't want to sort of get kids in grade 7 into too much philosophy. But anyways, it probably came out some ways. But so I reached out to my community, and I found that there was parents who had spent a whole season in the Antarctic. So I didn't tell the kids about the Antarctic. I brought them in. Oh, well, Mr. X or Ms. Y or whatever, they're able to talk about the Antarctic and tell us what it was really like. And so the kids would have their interview questions and they would ask those things, and then they would develop their reports from that. I had another parent that had spent a lifetime in a very dry desert, like northern Africa or someplace like that. Had other ones that had hiked in high altitude, these places in quotes, if Hatfield had been one of my parents, I would have asked him. However, I did have the people from the Newt people come and talk about the deep ocean, because they had spent basically a lifetime in the deep ocean, right? So these extreme kind of places.
It makes it real, right?
It makes it real, but at the same time, it's kind of going, these people have actually been there. It's not just a chapter in a textbook or whatever. And so I think the dissolving of that. And one of the great lessons that I learned, at Norgate, it has a high percentage of students. When I was there, 65% of the students were Indigenous. And when we would typically, ask parents to come in and have conferences, we got very little turnout. And I was there with the staff at that particular time, and we just sort of said, okay, how do we get engagement? And so this is where sometimes the teacher has to go into the community and say, what's valued in this community? So I don't know whose idea it was, but somebody said, let's put on a community dinner. We had 200 plus people show up. 200 plus people. And it was just a basic dinner, kind of with some comfort food kind of thing. And we went, okay, this is one way of dissolving the walls.
Yeah.
This is one way of, changing from that. And I sometimes think, if you draw upon our own Western traditions, what if we taught the same way Socrates did? Or Plato did? He walked around in the streets. Now, it was only wealthy young men that could walk around the streets with him. Okay, so that's another whole problem there, but that's how they learned. They walked around the street. They saw things. They talked about things. They experienced things. And then I think the community, in a certain extent, is part of that learning as well. You can't tell me the shopkeeper, didn't sort of say, oh, those are those, hey, come on over here. I want to talk to you about, what I'm doing today, kind of thing. And I just recently came back. I attended a Reggio Emilia conference in Reggio. Yeah. And part of that was I always wanted to go also to Pompeii, but we chose to go to Herculaneum. It's a smaller site and stuff. And I was really fascinated because the person that was our guide that we had hired, a really great interpreter, showed us what their fast food was. There was a fast food stand. There was street food. Where you'd be walking down the street and then they would have whatever fish stew or whatever, and that's what they had. And you're kind of going, wow, what a different kind of way of teaching and learning, right? And I think that part of it, and when I was doing more of that kind of work, I always invited the parents. And even if only a few of the parents could actually partake, then I think that also helped break down some of the walls. And so they would come with us, and I would also give them a responsibility. It was like, okay, yeah, you're going to come with us, but these are going to be your responsibilities, and you'll have a learning group with you, and these kinds of things. And eventually, what happens is that, okay, learning's here, learning's out there, and I think that also because a number of my students in my teaching there were, Indigenous, that was much more the way that they felt naturally, the way that they would learn anyways. So, well, why would we be...
Right.
Yeah, it felt better, There was a whole bunch of pluses, that had. But I think I would tell you my work in biology as an ecologist is that I'm not really going to get close to different organisms unless I go to their place and be part of their world. right? And I would say it's exactly the same thing working with communities. So you're absolutely right. Like, how do we make that possible? And I would be saying that if, the BC Parks Foundation is going to be doing this, how do these spaces become community spaces? Because I might have the means, and I have, one of my passions is tropical fish. And so I have swam in the Amazon with the fish that I had kept as a child, right? And it was a conservation project. And I'll tell you, it was a very interesting, a little bit interesting story. So my Tropical Fish Club here in Vancouver at the time was giving money to this thing called Project Piaba. Well, Project Piaba works with, in Portuguese, there's this term called piabos. It's the name for people who catch little ornamental fish. And I was going, what are we funding an organization that's going into the middle of the Amazon and paying people to catch little fish so that I can put them into my fish tank? There's something wrong ethically with that, right? And I was going to make a stink about it in the club. And then this thing came out and it said, how would you like to be part of a Project Piaba expedition? Anybody can sign up, so I signed up. And then I actually learned more of the story. So the thing is that every year in the Amazon, we know that the Amazon floods, right? And so what happens is when the Amazon floods, many of the fish spawn because that's the best time to spawn. It's like salmon come into the rivers just after the water, usually in November, December around here. That's when they're doing most of their spawning because, of course, we usually get fall rains, and that's when they come in because that freshen, right? Well, this is exactly what the fish are doing. But when the Amazon recedes, there are pockets of water that dry up where literally millions of little fish perish. And so what the Piabos do is find these little pockets of fish, and those are the fish that they take from.
Wow.
And they've been doing this for 30, 40, 50 years, okay?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing they do. And they usually are small families or a collection of families in rather remote parts. We were mostly on the Rio Negro, a tributary to the main Amazon. And they're now the watch people. They're watching for the illegal logging. They're watching for the conservation issues, the illegal burning, and reporting those things. Because if the forest doesn't exist,
they know the connection. Right?
They know the connection.
Yeah.
If the forest doesn't exist, and we went to one place, for example, and they were raising lots of different species, more than one species of aquatic turtle. And yes, some of those turtles were eaten, but some of them were also released, into the environment, right? So it changed a lot. So actually, working with the Piabos, in the Rio Negro and in other scenarios, it actually has some benefits to the long-term, protection of that part of the Amazonian forest, right? So once again, by having that direct experience and seeing how those things worked, I think that it's important to sort of get out. Well, I have the ability to do that. Yeah. How does somebody who doesn't have those means to do that? How do you make that possible? So I think that that's one of the things about having these potential outdoor learning spaces at multiple locations, because schools, especially elementary schools, but schools are easy to get to. I mean, let's face it, we could hear from, we could go to Letette Farm, for example, and they are growing food and they sell food and everything else. And one of the high schools here has a community garden, that they took the old school out and they put a community garden in that space, right? Yeah. So I think that those are places that we can actively get involved with. I'd also say that it's sort of similar. So if I'm going to engage as a parent in sports, and we all know that there is a sports culture around hockey, around soccer, around many sports, I would say, well, what's the other side that I'm helping my child in? Right? Because that may develop, the kinesthetic ability, the teamwork, all the great things that can come out of sport. But where are some of the other things that are happening? Where are there opportunities for other parts of my child's personality to express themselves, right? And I think there are those things. There's, like, for example, there is Nature Kids BC. There is a variety of different kinds of programs that happen here in North Vancouver around for the Lynn Canyon Ecology Center. I just looked at their things. In the Lower Mainland, Metro Parks has programs that are going on all the time that are part of the programs. So there are those kinds of things that are happening. So my parents did exactly that. So yes, I was in, Lynn Valley soccer as a kid. Yeah. But I was also in the Lynn Valley Cub group and Scout group. Mm-hmm. And guess who one of the leaders
the whole
was?
Child, right?
Yeah, who was one of the leaders? Oh, my mom was one of the leaders, And my mom was one of the leaders in the Cub group. And what did she do? Oh, well, her thing wasn't sort of camp skills. Her thing was art. So I remember there was a bunch of guys in my basement in Lynn Valley, and we all built paper mache animal masks. Because my mom had that talent. I remember mine was a rhino. But anyways, so that's what we did. So we were creating, these things. So that was what my mom was offering. My mom was an artist. My mom, had those sort of crafting kind of skills. My dad was the guy that, I think he sponsored every sports team that was there. He was a coach for baseball. When we went on trips, we had a big station wagon at the time. We'd all pack into the station wagon and, we'd go off on, play soccer in Washington State or whatever, So that was how my dad expressed himself more, but it wasn't like that other stuff was less. No. It was just the whole thing, right?
A final question, and it's sort of a flip side of when I talked about the anxious generation.
Mm-hmm.
In many ways, this generation has some amazing qualities coming up. They're more open. They're more compassionate. They're the leadership skills I'm seeing. So with your work with new teachers at the university, what gives you hope in the students that you're working with for the future of teaching and what you're seeing in this generation coming up?
I think they're very inspired. Mm-hmm. We said before that there's two sides of a crisis. Mm-hmm. When you're confronted by a crisis, there are different responses. The worst response is to become despondent. And I see some people that are stepping up. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think part of our work is to support them in stepping up. So this field course that I've had the privilege of working on since 2019, in one of the assignments is a community service. Yeah. So what are we going to do with that? Mm-hmm. How are we going to help that? And we're doing it in Akatsum, How Sound. So what is our reciprocity to Akatsum How Sound? What is the concept, what are we giving back to that place? Because that place has made it possible. So I would be saying, it's a classic. I mean, a classic, some of the ideas from, the 1960s and early 1970s, act locally, right? I would say for that. And definitely that's doable at the family level and the individual level. Mm. Now, where they take that later on, it's hard to say, and I worry to a certain extent, maybe it's just the way I think about the world, but 99.99999% of the time, things are actually working.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
We still have air that we can breathe.
Yeah.
The sun still warms the planet. Yeah. There still is water around. Mm-hmm. And so it's not like a bad day for the dinosaurs. That can happen. Yeah. I'm not saying that can't happen. And but the bottom line here is that really there's a whole bunch of things that are working. And I think that one of the things I think we can do is provide somewhat of a better sort of balance. I remember one of the things somebody was talking about, one of the, CBC reporters was in at a class or something like that, and one of the children asked, why do we only hear about, sort of these bad things? And the reporter said something like, well, if one of the children in this class fell and broke their leg, you wouldn't want to hear about that? And the kid said, no, they wouldn't. But saying that, I heard that answer, and I sort of thought, yeah, but if I knew one of my friends went down the road and found $5, I'd want to hear about that too.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So I'm not talking about just telling. I think we have to be honest,
Yes.
and I think we have to have, that whole perspective that I think that we're much more conscious now, truth and then reconciliation, and actually it's become now reconciliation,
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of things that are happening now where people are thinking it's not about conservation in the environment, it's about regeneration.
Mm-hmm.
What can I do in this space to make it possible? I'm here sitting in your beautiful yard, for example. You're creating a space that allows multiple things to enjoy this space. I think of the work that my partner and I have done where we live in North Vancouver. When we first arrived there was a 1960-something house in the middle of 2 pieces of grass with a couple of big trees.
Yeah.
You can't hardly see any of that anymore. You can see the big trees, but we've sort of said this is a space for other things as well.
Yeah.
And so we have a bear that sort of wanders through our yard as it makes its way from one place to the next, and it has knocked down the fence, but we just rebuild the fence, and those kinds of things. The fence was probably rotting anyways, but it sort of says there's an opportunity there. Or we also use our thinking in that particular scenario and say, okay, this isn't a good time to put out the suet because the bears are really hungry right now, and so I'm not going to do that. So, but they don't go after the hummingbird feeders, right? And so we have hummingbird feeders out right now because that sort of is a way of sort of saying, hey, look, this is a way. And I do a lot of my work now, a lot of my mentoring work now, and this is an open invitation to you too. Maybe we'll do this that way, okay?
Yeah.
I do walking conversations.
Okay. Yeah.
So I live very close to many trailheads.
Mm-hmm.
And we walk into the forest and we have these similar kinds of conversations like the conversations with you two today.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the mentoring students that I'm working with that are either graduate students or, going to be soon graduate students at the university level, I offer that to them. And we have these conversations. And I've come to think that one way that I can pay this place back for everything that it has given me is by having positive conversations with positive vibes in that space. Mm-hmm. I have no way of knowing what cedar takes from that. I have no way of knowing what granite takes from that. But in some ways, in my sort of my human limited way, I'm kind of thinking this is a way that I'm putting positive vibes out into a place that has given me so much and has made it possible for me to be in that place. And I just talked about this the other day because we were having a wrap-up at the university at UBC about our year working with student teachers, and they asked, like what do you think you did well with this year, and what did you rock this year? And I said, coming to where the students were, because for the last few years I've offered these walking conversations, and a fair number of my students have taken me up on this opportunity, but some can't. So this year, for the first year, I had a couple that didn't, and I sort of said, well, what's close to you? Where can we walk? Okay. I had half of them. I walked in their neighborhood.
Oh, wow. Nice.
And I also believe that one of the things that's also really heavily influenced me is living with dogs. And every time I walk in the forest with my dog and I are at the same place at the same time, but he's in a completely different world than I am. He challenges me every time that I go into the forest to see the world differently. Yeah. I can't see it in dog world. I don't have 10,000 times, the sense of smell like he does that compared to humans. I don't have the acute hearing that he does. I can't read smell. One of the things I've recently been fascinated about dogs is that, we have a sense of time. Dogs actually can tell time in a physical way because they can tell when something has been there an hour ago, 2 hours ago, 3 hours ago. So they temporally have a sense of time.
Okay.
And that just blows me away.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you. What a lovely and hopeful note to end this conversation. And Victor, I really appreciate your wealth of knowledge and experience. And I think we first met when you were principal at outdoor school, 1991. Were you there in 91? 91.
I started there in 84.
Yeah. Okay, so 91 you were there. I was 25-year-old teacher coming up to outdoor school. And I remember the day, because we walked into the auditorium and you did your usual introductions to everyone. And then you would point on every teacher to tell them to introduce themselves. And I remember you said, and here we have some city slicker from Lonsdale. I don't think I was wearing outdoor clothes or whatever, but so that's a while back.
I always remember you as being a stylish person,
Well, there
Martin.
you go. I think I was over stylish for outdoor school.
Well, I really enjoyed our conversation today, and what I love the imagery of dissolving the walls, right? That just having the walls not there and just going any which way.
Yeah. And, in this thesis work that I'm working on, one of my sort of introductory pieces is I said before, it's like walking through this sea of knowledge and only some of the crystals stick to you. The other aspect I would say is that what I've tried to talk about is in my first visit to the place it was one of those days in the summertime. It was July or August or something like that, and there was a sandbar. And there's something about, with, in your clothes and just letting the place absorb into you. And I talk about on that day, at that moment, if I trace back my thing that's where I lost myself. There is no you and it. You are it. It is you. And, we do know, for example, at a certain level, if you're a gamma ray, for example, there is no human. It just goes through us, So and I like to think about how can we dissolve these edges that we create. And I think it's important. I think it's nice to know that we think that this is a table here and not a collection of densely packed molecules or something like that. But I think it's important. I think it's an important aspect. And how can we make that possible for all places, all people?
And I love the idea of the walking conversation. I think that's so powerful too. When I was president of the NVTA, I often would walk with members that we had things to work out. And it was so much different when we did that than if we sat in the office and tried to work it out. It just
there's a whole
got
pedagogy
the mind going in such a different way.
There's a whole pedagogy around walking. Because I think, I said before that I don't have the sense of smell or hearing as acute as my dog does. But what we are really good at doing is we're really good walkers. We are really good walkers. And, so I think that that's an important thing in this sort of movement and thinking. The other thing I think that's really important as well is that movement, thinking, and speaking out loud. Because, we're really good, as one of the people that I follow. There's a really interesting nature journaler. His name is John Muir Laws. And he has a beautiful piece about, you could pick up any object. He picks up a fir cone, for example. And he said there's so much information in this fir cone that you could theoretically pull apart, that our brain is really good at throwing out most of it. So the question is, how do we take that few moments to sort of absorb some of it? And one of the ways of doing that is talking about what you're looking at while you're looking at it. Because in the process of thinking about what you're saying, your brain slows down for a fraction of a second to be able to do that. And one of the other people that I follow is a guy who's now passed on, an eco-philosopher, and his name is Arne Ness. And we had the opportunity to go to one of his retreat cabins. I have sort of a wish to go to these places that were inspiring to some of the people, the writing that I like, and Arne Ness's writing. And so we had the opportunity of going to his retreat cabin in Norway. And he said that, and he was a world traveler. And he said he came to the conclusion in his life that he could find out more about the world 1 meter from his cabin than going around the world. It's a really interesting, because, and, if you think about, Asian perspectives, that contemplative way of being, and thinking about where you are and who you are, I think how do we provide those opportunities, I think is probably one of the biggest, future challenges that we face.
Well, Roy and I could talk to you all day. We really could. Maybe we should, for season 2, we'll have another conversation, maybe a walking conversation too.
Yeah.
We could record.
That would be good.
Yeah. So thank you so much,
Thank
Victor.
you.
Yeah, no problem.
Well, that was an excellent interview with Victor when we got to go outside into my garden where the wild things are.
Yes, I could have listened to him or talked to him much longer, but then it would be the longest. We'd have to do a podcast in 2 parts.
We would, yes.
But what I really loved is in our conversation was the imagery of having the classroom walls disintegrate and looking at the outside world within the community and the green spaces as an extension of the classroom.
Yeah, and I just like his intellect, his breadth of knowledge, his wisdom, what he's gained as both an educator and clearly someone who's just curious about the human condition and where we are and trying to make it understandable for everyone. And I liked his 3 ideas that really kind of put it into a capsule to help teachers be successful. And that was the idea of a mentor, right?
Mentorship.
Make it successful.
Yes.
And then making it accessible, easy to get outside,
Easy,
right? If it's hard,
easy access,
if there's a wall, people won't do it. They'll try it once. But the third thing is also that you got to make it a habit.
Yes.
Right? A daily habit.
Create that daily access. And I think sometimes that becomes a stumbling block for a lot of teachers.
Yeah.
They say, I tried it once.
Yeah, no.
Right?
Well, how many times have we tried something once and it failed, right?
Almost everything you try once is a failure.
But learning from that and plowing through and then making it a habit, it will make you realize the kids are calmer, and the kids then want to do it because their brains become, in a way, they aren't happening with the supercharge of all the online world we have nowadays.
When have you ever asked a group of students if they'd like to do something different, and they all said yes?
Right?
Right? They're all going, oh.
We're naturally resistant to change. We
Yes.
are. But then when you make it a pattern and a habit, people realize it was a good habit to get. There are some bad habits you should break, but some things are good habits, and it's good to plow on through, do it a daily thing, and also get a mentor on staff. Find someone else to do it with. Work with other people. Encourage your staff, right? Make it a theme for your school. And there's the sound, Mr. Hunt, that the episode, number 20, has come to an end. And, I was just thinking back to our introduction where we talked about animal sounds. So the
yes,
Beach
I
Boys.
think there's something wrong with that statement
So
I made.
if you want to still stay part of this 5 for a beer contest and you've been looking for that one thing to talk about, maybe make a comment about what the real title of that album is.
You can correct me and it won't bother me at all.
You'll be okay with it. This podcast is organic, taking shape with each episode. Building resiliency for teachers everywhere.
That sounds great.
And our website is stuntbrothers.ca.
That's stuntbrothers.ca.
We will chat again
After the bell.